Your life is fine, not perfect, not extraordinary, but organized enough to function without major disruptions. You take care of what needs to be taken care of. You meet your responsibilities, you keep your routine standing, and from the outside, nothing seems out of place. And still, your mind is always busy, not in a chaotic way, not dramatic, not emotionally explosive. It simply does not slow down. Thoughts appear one after another. They connect. They extend themselves, even when there is no real urgency demanding that level of activity. And that is exactly where the confusion begins. Because intuitively, we learn to associate a busy mind with a problematic life. If the mind feels full, something must be wrong. If thoughts do not stop, there must be some kind of anxiety, conflict, or unresolved stress behind it. But what happens when that is not true? What happens when life is relatively calm, stable, predictable, and yet the mind remains full, active, constantly in motion? This experience is far more common than it seems, especially among functional, responsible, mentally active people. People who think clearly, who analyze, who anticipate, who reflect. People who are not in crisis, but who also cannot fully switch off. You may notice this more clearly during moments when, in theory, you should be resting. At the end of the day, when everything has already been done. On weekends, when there are no immediate deadlines. At night, when the body is tired, but the mind remains alert. The body lies down. The mind stays standing. Simple thoughts begin to surface. Scenes from the day. Conversations that already happened. Situations that might still happen. Small plans, mental adjustments, silent revisions. None of this seems heavy enough to justify the fatigue that appears afterward. But taken together, it creates a clear sense of a full mind, as if there were no internal space left for real rest. This is the central point that needs to be understood from the very beginning. A busy mind is not always a mind overloaded by problems. In many cases, it is simply a mind that is active during a moment of stability. When life demands quick responses, the mind reacts to what is happening. It solves, decides, responds, executes. There is a clear focus, even if that focus is tiring. When life enters a more stable rhythm, that external demand decreases. And the mind, which was shaped to operate continuously, does not simply shut down. It keeps functioning because that is its pattern. The human mind was not designed to rest spontaneously. It was designed to monitor the environment, anticipate risks, organize information, and keep things under control. When there is nothing external demanding that monitoring, the mind turns inward. And that is where what many people call a busy mind appears. It is not an attack of negative thoughts. It is not an emotional storm. It is a constant flow of mental activity that seems neutral, but never truly stops. A simple example helps make this clearer. Imagine an ordinary moment in the day, like taking a shower. The body is relaxing. The water is flowing. There is nothing to solve in that moment. Even so, the mind begins to work. You mentally rehearse a future conversation. You reorganize what you need to do afterward. You revisit something that happened earlier and think about how it could have gone differently. When the shower ends, nothing went wrong. But the mind worked the entire time. Another even more common example appears at night. You lie down, close your eyes, and realize that the day is over. It is precisely at that moment that the mind begins to list small pending matters, loose thoughts, ideas that were not invited but show up anyway. Not because you are worried, but because there is now enough external silence for internal movement to become noticeable. This is an important distinction. Silence does not create mental noise. It simply reveals it. Understanding this completely changes how you interpret the experience. Because from that point on, the question stops being, "What is wrong with me?" and starts becoming something much more precise and useful. Why does the mind remain active even when there is no real demand happening right now? That question is not meant to be answered quickly, but to open space for a deeper understanding of how attention functions when it has no clear destination. When that question appears, something important has already happened internally. You stopped interpreting a busy mind as a personal flaw and started seeing it as a form of functioning. That changes the tone of the analysis, because now it is not about fixing an error, but about understanding a mechanism. The mind remains active when life is fine because attention was not turned off along with the tasks. It simply lost its main object. An attention without an object rarely stays neutral. It begins to move on its own. Human attention is naturally directional. It was made to attach to something, to follow something, to sustain something. When there is a problem, a task, or a concrete situation, that attachment happens automatically. When that disappears, attention does not dissolve. It becomes loose, and loose attention often turns into constant observation of one's own thoughts. This is a central point that is almost never consciously noticed. Most people believe they think too much because they have too many thoughts. But in practice, the opposite happens. Thoughts appear because attention is free, without a defined place to rest. It is like a system that keeps running even after it has completed its main function. It does not shut down on its own. It simply changes focus. When there is nothing external left to monitor, the mind begins to monitor its own internal flow. It watches ideas emerge, evaluates possibilities, revisits memories, simulates future scenarios. Not because this is necessary in that moment, but because monitoring is the role it learned to perform. This state is particularly common among functional, organized, responsible people. People who spent a long time using the mind as their main tool to keep life in order. When life enters a more stable period, that tool keeps operating, even without a clear function. That is why a busy mind does not always come with intense emotion. Often it is cold, logical, organized. You are not worried, but you are thinking. You are not anxious, but you are analyzing. You are not in conflict, but you are mentally reviewing small things. This kind of mental activity is quiet, but continuous, and precisely because it is quiet, it goes unnoticed for a long time. A simple example helps illustrate this concretely. Imagine a Sunday afternoon with no commitments. You sit on the couch, check your phone for a few minutes, then put it aside. The environment is calm. There are no strong stimuli. It is at this moment that the mind begins to fill the space. It thinks about small tasks from the week. It mentally replays conversations that already happened. It imagines how certain situations could be handled better. None of this is urgent, but everything feels slightly relevant. When you notice, an hour has passed, and you feel strangely tired, even though you did nothing. That fatigue does not come from effort, but from the continuous occupation of attention. The important point here is that the mind is not agitated because something is wrong. It is active because it never received a clear signal that it can stop monitoring. In older contexts, the body and the environment offered natural pauses. Physical fatigue, the absence of stimulation, the end of the day imposed by natural light. Today, those pauses almost no longer exist. We live in a constant intermediate state, neither fully engaged nor fully disconnected. Always available, always thinking about something, even if that something is too small to justify so much mental activity. This intermediate state keeps attention partially active all the time, and partially active attention generates a constant flow of low-intensity but high-frequency thoughts. That is what creates the sensation of a full mind without a clear reason. It is not a spike of stress, but a silent accumulation. From here, it becomes easier to understand why simply resting does not always solve the problem. Because physical rest does not give attention a destination, it only removes tasks, leaving the mind free to continue monitoring whatever is available, including itself. And it is exactly at this point that an important difference begins to emerge between stopping the body and allowing the mind to truly slow down. A difference that has nothing to do with effort or control, but with the way attention does, or does not, find a natural place to rest. When it becomes clear that the mind remains active because attention stays in monitoring mode, another important perception almost automatically appears. It is not just that attention lacks a destination, it is that it starts attaching itself to anything minimally available. And in the absence of clear stimuli, what is most available are the thoughts themselves. The mind begins to observe itself. A thought appears, attention attaches to it, another thought emerges in response, and a self-feeding sequence forms. There is no central problem driving this process. There is only a system that keeps running because it never received a clear signal that it can slow down. That is why, many times, the mind feels busy even when the thoughts themselves are not particularly relevant. You are not ruminating on a major conflict. You are simply following the mental flow, almost like watching something pass by, without noticing the time involved. This type of mental occupation is often confused with anxiety, but there is a subtle difference. In anxiety, there is tension, negative anticipation, emotional urgency. Here, what exists is continuity, thought after thought, without a real pause between them. This continuity creates the sensation that the mind never rests because, in fact, it does not find a natural stopping point. Each thought seems to pull the next one, not because it is important, but because attention is already there, available, following along. A common example of this appears during moments of prolonged silence. You are sitting, maybe looking out the window, not doing anything specific. A simple thought appears, something trivial, like a future task or a recent memory. Before you realize it, the mind has already turned that into a small chain of associations. Nothing dramatic happens, but the mental space is gradually filled. What is curious is that while this is happening, you may even feel relatively calm. There is no visible agitation. There is no intense discomfort. And yet, at the end of that period, there is a sense of weariness, as if something had been used in the background. That weariness comes from the fact that attention remained active the entire time, even without a clear purpose. It did not enter rest. It merely changed objects repeatedly. Another important point is that the modern mind rarely receives clear signals of closure. Work ends, but ideas about work continue. Conversations end, but mental simulations remain. The day comes to an end, but the mind keeps reviewing, adjusting, anticipating. There is no longer a sharp boundary between activity and pause. Everything blends into a continuous state of semi-activity. In that state, the mind is not fully engaged, but it is also not turned off. It stays in a kind of constant vigilance, observing possibilities, checking scenarios, keeping everything under control, even when there is nothing concrete to control. This helps explain why many people report feeling more mentally tired on seemingly calm days than on truly busy ones. When the day is full, attention has a clear focus. When the day is empty, attention spreads. Spreading attention consumes energy in a less noticeable, but more prolonged way. There is also an important cultural factor involved. We live in an environment that values constant thinking, continuous planning, permanent optimization. Thinking a lot is rarely seen as something negative. On the contrary, it is often associated with responsibility, intelligence, commitment. Because of that, few people question this mode of functioning. They feel the fatigue, but they do not identify the cause. The mind is always active, and that seems too normal to be examined. Over time, this continuous activity begins to reduce the sense of internal space. Everything feels mentally filled. There is no real silence, only shorter intervals between thoughts, and that is where many attempts at relaxation fail, because relaxing the body does not automatically change the way attention is operating. You can be comfortable sitting or lying down with no physical tension at all and still be mentally alert, following thoughts as if they were invisible tasks. When that happens, the impression arises that the mind does not obey, that it works on its own, out of control. But what is really happening is simpler and more subtle. Attention was never invited to stop monitoring. It merely changed its object. Understanding this opens a different possibility for relating to the mind itself. It is not about forcing silence, eliminating thoughts, or fighting mental activity. It is about noticing how attention moves when it does not find a clear place to rest, and how that continuous movement, even when subtle, shapes the internal experience throughout the day. That perception alone already begins to change the way the mind responds to moments of quiet, because little by little it becomes clearer that the problem was never thinking too much, but keeping attention permanently awake, even when nothing is asking for it.